It is Christmas time, 1998, in the small town of Ortona on Italy's Adriatic coast. Old soldiers have gathered here to remember another Christmas, 55 years ago, when they were surrounded by mayhem and death.
Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn.
Canadian veterans of the Second World War have come to meet with their former German enemies to jointly pay homage to fallen comrades.
All of us made history.
Yeah, right.
Definitely. Yes, of course.
Oh, yeah. I hope we're making history today. That's the kind of history we like to make.
When these men last met here, it was in the heat of battle. Christmas time in Ortona, 1943. The fifth Christmas of the war. Canadians and Germans are fighting house to house and hand to hand.
You couldn't move. Every time you moved, somebody shot at you.
Sometimes I was with the Canadian soldiers together, like you and myself, you know, just a few meters far away, you know.
Instead of going down the streets, they'd blow a hole into the next building and then rush, throw some grenades in and then rush through.
We didn't think that the Germans would hold out Ortona, but they did, and it had to be cleared or we'd have had this ulcer on our side eating into us.
The fight for Ortona becomes a matter of national pride for both the Allies and the Germans. A bitter slugging match in the rubble of a ruined city. And both sides would pay a terrible price. No one who survived the Battle of Ortona would ever forget that Christmas in hell. It is the spring of 1943, and finally the moment the Allies have been waiting for. After 4 years of fighting, they are ready to attack Fortress Europe. British General Bernard Montgomery has defeated Rommel, the Desert Fox, and North Africa has fallen. In the east, the Soviets are driving the Germans out of Russia. Now the Allies will make the first assault on Europe. The target is Italy. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill calls it the soft underbelly of Europe. Codenamed Operation Husky, it will be the first test of the 1st Canadian Division. They will fight alongside the British 8th Army.
I think all of us, there was kind of a cheer went up when we realized we were going to be part of the 8th Army. The 8th Army by this time was famous for the successes Montgomery had had in North Africa after the terrible reverses we'd had for the months and the years preceding.
Still fresh in the minds of Canadian soldiers is their army's disaster of the year before. The raid on Dieppe had been a slaughterhouse. 3,000 Canadians were killed, wounded, or captured. As they board the troop ships in July 1943, the men of the 1st Division prayed there would be no mistake this time.
I was never anxious to have a go at the Germans or anybody else, not being very brave. They're not anxious to go fighting, and I could never understand this business. We've got to get blooded, and they sure as heck got blooded at Dieppe.
I think, you know, because it was a big fiasco, they just butchered him.
This would be the first battle action for the Canadian Army since the disaster of Dieppe. Only when the convoy is at sea do the Canadians learn their target is Sicily, and then on to Italy. They suffer their first casualties even before landing. As the convoy enters the Mediterranean, 3 ships fall prey to German U-boats. 60 Canadians are killed, and they lose 500 vehicles, including many ambulances and 40 cannons. those losses would have an impact on the fighting to come. On July 10th, the untested Canadians land on the south coast of Sicily with Montgomery's British forces. The 7th U.S. Army under General George Patton lands further west. When the Canadians come ashore, there is only sporadic resistance from Italian coastal defenses.
We had very few casualties. I think we had 3 or 4 men killed. We had 1 officer wounded and about 7 men wounded. And by the time the day was over, our battalion had captured over 400 Italians.
Really, the Italian troops were not interested in the war. All they wanted to do was go home to their families and their farms. We thought at first it would be a very easy war, but on the 16th of July, we ran into the rear guard of the German army.
Now the Canadians get their first taste of battle against an enemy that still has plenty of fight. It is a foreshadowing of the desperate, bloody fighting that will mark the entire Italian campaign.
The Germans let the head of our convoys pass before surrounding us, hitting us from 2 sides. We got through it quite well, even though we were in an ambush. We got out with 6 dead and 25 wounded. That was our first real combat experience.
The German troops are experts at this kind of warfare, a fighting retreat designed to conserve their own soldiers and punish the pursuers.
The Germans were just fighting a withdrawal fight, you know, and they would, when they got ready to go, they'd throw everything at you but the kitchen sink, and they'd back up to the next position. They were very good at it. And they kept backing up, and we kept chasing them.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC. High explosive shells from our tanks in the square seemed to be ripping the town to pieces. And the enemy's anti-tank shells and mortars were crashing into the buildings everywhere.
The Voice of War correspondent Matthew Halton brings the battles into the living rooms of every household back home. The CBC records the sights and sounds of Canadian troops in combat. Halton and fellow reporter Peter Stursberg give Canadians a window on the war.
The Canadians outflanked Adrano and caused the German withdrawal from the bridgehead line. Its artillery lit up the hills during the night as it polished the German rearguards off the ridges north of the town.
It really brought the war much closer to people than they actually heard the sound of the guns and even the songs and so on like that. And it brought the war much more into the family room. And in fact, there was a cartoon that of people suffering from shell shock, hearing all this shell fire on the radio.
But one battle never reported is the one raging in the Allied camp. The Sicilian campaign is marked by rivalry between Generals Patton and Montgomery, the American and British Army commanders. Both want to win the race to Messina, the final objective on the northern tip of the island.
Patton got into Messina ahead of Montgomery. Montgomery arrives late, and that annoyed him greatly. So that could have been the seeds of the beginning of the competition.
The rivalry between Allied commanders is costly. Preoccupied with their turf war, they make a mistake that will come back to haunt the Canadians in Italy.
Maybe this race to Messina, this rivalry between the Americans and the British and between Patton and Montgomery was one of the reasons why the Germans were able to escape and escape with most of their equipment.
As the fighting winds down in Sicily, in Rome the Italian government is in crisis. In late July, the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini is ousted from office, and the new government of Marshal Pietro Badoglio undertakes secret negotiations with the Allies. But Germany is not about to surrender Italy without a fight. In the early morning hours of September 3rd, the British and the Canadians strike at the Italian mainland. Enemy positions have been softened up by massive naval and artillery bombardments. Italian resistance to the landings is minimal. In 5 days, Canadian units have advanced more than 100 kilometers through southern Italy. Italy surrenders on September 8th.
The Italians have accepted the armistice without demonstrations that you would expect from these emotional Latin people. There was some excitement on the night the news came like a blinding flash of light in the darkness. Bonfires were lit in the country districts of Sicily, and crowds gathered around singing and cheering.
As the Italian army surrenders, it appears Churchill was right. Italy might indeed be the easy way into Europe.
We thought it would be over. We didn't realize that the Germans were going to stand in Italy. We thought the Italians have surrendered, the Germans will get out, and that was our view of how wrong we were.
Hitler is furious at the Italian surrender. He sends troops to occupy Rome, and the new Italian government flees the capital. Hitler's plan is not to drive the Allies out of Italy, but to withdraw slowly and make them pay for every foot of ground.
They would hold a point until it became obvious that they might be outflanked or they might be overrun, and then they would attempt to carry out an orderly withdrawal and establish another strong point further back. And they were very proficient at that. They made the progress difficult. They mined the roads, they blew the bridges.
Italy is an ideal battleground for the Germans. The terrain suits their tactics perfectly. The country is laced with deep valleys and cut by rivers and gullies.
A defender's paradise. Probably one German soldier could be as effective in defense on any Italian front as 3 or 4 German soldiers would be in Normandy, or 4 or 5 would be in the Soviet Union. You could do that much with the terrain if you had good demolitions, good engineers, you knew which culverts to blow and which road bridges. Just a handful of troops, you could hold up entire divisions for days and weeks at a time.
Their delaying tactics buy the Germans time to set up their winter line, a series of heavily fortified defensive positions starting about 100 kilometers south of Rome in the west to the Adriatic coast south of Ortona in the east. By mid-November 1943, the Canadians have advanced 500 kilometers up the boot of Italy. Now they are closing in on the German winter line. But once again, rivalry between the British and American commanders has weakened the Allies.
Mark Clark, the general who commanded the U.S. Fifth Army, and Montgomery both hated each other. They mutually loathed each other. And both of them were competing all the time to be the most successful division. They both wanted to be the army that got into Rome. And so they weren't working hand in hand at all.
Instead of attacking together, they split their forces. While the Americans attack at Monte Cassino, Montgomery sends the British and Canadians to the opposite coast. In order to beat the Americans to Rome, he plans to push up the Adriatic coast to Pescara and then turn west to capture the capital. But Montgomery hasn't allowed for the weather. British troops are soon bogged down by torrential rains. Their tanks and heavy equipment become mired in the muck. Now it is the Canadians who must lead the attack across the Moro River. Waiting for them on the other side are crack German troops, veterans of the North African fighting, and regiments of the elite 1st Parachute Division. At midnight on December 5th, the Canadians attack across the river.
Things went very well initially until we came to the Moro Ridge, or the Vino Ridge is more commonly known. And then the enemy opened up with the machine guns and mortars and anti-tank guns and artillery.
The vineyards were on concrete posts, and then the wires strung between the concrete posts, and then the vines all growing up on those wires. And it was absolutely almost impossible to get through. You had to crawl on your stomach through mud to get anywhere.
Again, the Germans have picked their battleground well. The stone farmhouses that dot the landscape are like little fortresses. This is ideal terrain for defenders and a death trap for the Canadian attackers.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC. We went forward along a muddy path through an orchard where there had been olives, but now only death. All around us, one of the bloodiest actions of this war was being fought.
After 3 days of hard fighting, the Canadians finally break through the Moreau River line. They have paid dearly. The casualties in some brigades are higher than anything the Canadians have previously suffered. And though they are now just a few kilometers from Ortona, there is far worse to come. The German defenders do not give up ground easily, and by the end of the first week of fighting, Canadian units have advanced less than 2 kilometers from their starting point. They can almost see Ortona now, but between them and the city is a ravine 200 feet deep and 200 yards wide. The Canadians called it the Gully, and none who were there would ever forget it.
The Germans dug positions in what's called the reverse slope, which is the southern slope. So they would wait until the Canadians laid down their bombardment, and then when the bombardment was done, they would come out of their holes, run up to the top of the edge of the ravine and into their slit trenches, and be waiting with their machine guns and that as the Canadians came forward.
Wave after wave of Canadian soldiers are thrown against the German defenses in the gully. Every attack fails, and the Canadians suffer staggering losses.
We attacked, but we couldn't dislodge the Germans. They were dug in up on just behind the crest of the ridge, and of course behind that was the famous gully, which was a tremendous defensive position.
Finally, the Canadian commander, General Vaux, tries a different strategy. He will try to go around the gully and outflank the German positions. A company of Vendus, the Royal 22nd Regiment, targets Casa Berardi. It is a large 3-story farmhouse near the end of the gully and within striking distance of the main road leading into Ortona.
So there was an opportunity to cross the gully there and capture Casa Berardi, and then basically outflank the German position at that point. The gully would cease to be that important because you're now on the other side of it. You can put tank fire right down the length of the gully and force them out.
The Vendus fight their way to within a half a kilometer of the farmhouse. Then they run into a German panzer. They must take it out or be cut to pieces.
The Germans spotted the Piat anti-tank weapon, and I saw the tank's cannon lower. It came down like this, and the corporal didn't have time to fire. A shot from the tank blew Corporal Turcotte apart.
The Vendus blind the tank with smoke, and another anti-tank weapon finally knocks it out. Now, as they push towards the farmhouse, they realize they are virtually surrounded by the enemy. Company commander, Captain Paul Triquet, uses their predicament to inspire them.
He said, when we get there, he said, we have enemies on our left, enemies in front, and enemies on our right, all around. There's only one safe place, and it's our objective.
The decimated company of the Vendus finally takes Casa Berardi. But there are now so few of them left, they can go no further.
We had to consolidate. We stopped there, and being stopped, the Germans were in position to pummel us. At the time, we couldn't go any further because there were only about 15 of us left.
The fight at Casa Berardi will become legend in the history of the Royal 22nd, and it will earn Captain Paul Triquet the Commonwealth's highest military award, the Victoria Cross. Though the Vendus hold their position, the Canadians still cannot break German resistance in the gully. The next day, General Montgomery shows up at Canadian headquarters and tears into General Vaux. He doesn't care about the Canadian losses. He wants the gully taken, and fast.
Montgomery sort of took the attitude that if Vaux was having a problem, then it was Vaux's problem, and you go solve it. Don't come crying to me.
He continued to always be urging Vaux on to greater and greater haste. You know, keep what's holding you up. You know, why are you not going forward? And I think that put an enormous amount of pressure on Vaux and may have led to some of his what were really misguided decisions in throwing his battalions forward one at a time.
The price of Montgomery's impatience is the needless sacrifice of Canadian lives. For even repeated poundings by artillery cannot soften the German positions.
And when they called off the barrage, and the Germans just popped their heads up, and we were caught without a covering barrage, and we were, well, literally mowed down, as it were, and our attack failed. And so they halted it. And we stayed there overnight, and one of our companies had got well ahead, and they were butchered.
Meanwhile, the Royal Canadian Regiment is attacking the crossroads north of the gully, and they are faring no better.
We probably attacked with 4 rifle companies, not 400 men, but probably 320 men among them. When we took the crossroads, we had 158 men left on their feet.
After 9 days of the worst fighting they have ever seen, the Canadians finally take the gully and the crossroads. Now they can clearly see the town of Ortona, and they think the worst is over. The Allies are so certain the Germans won't defend it, Montgomery is already planning to turn Ortona into a rest area. No one suspects the Germans are preparing to hold it at any cost.
It was an important strategic position for the Germans on the Adriatic coast, because a big street is going from the south till to the north, railway and a port town.
The civilians of Ortona guess what is coming when German troops begin banging on their doors.
The Germans came and told us to evacuate the town, and so we grabbed what we could. And with the family, a few miles out of Ortona, on the other hill, with the hope to watch the house.
What 13-year-old Americo Casanova watches instead is a huge explosion in the heart of Ortona. In a flash, half of the city's grand cathedral is blown away. German demolition teams have begun preparing a deadly surprise for the Canadians.
They blew up a lot of houses and brought them down, so they were rubble piles into the streets. So they've blocked and actually channeled a lot of the streets so that the Canadians, if they do come into the town, aren't going to be able to move easily from one street to another. Instead, they're going to have to go directly down certain pathways that the Germans have opened up and have allowed to still exist.
The piles of rubble serve 2 purposes. They stop the Canadian tanks, and they funnel the infantry into a killing zone. The defensive strategy is the work of experts. Ortona is held by 2 battalions of the German Parachute Division, an elite unit of the Luftwaffe.
It was made into a very serious battle because it introduced the German paratroop battalion, which were extremely well-trained troops.
Like the Canadians, they are all volunteers. Many are veterans of the fighting in Rotterdam, Leningrad, Tobruk, Crete, and Sicily. The paratroopers are tough and experienced.
German defensive doctrine, as it was at the time, which is basically that you mine everything, you booby-trap everything, you build your fortifications in the basements of houses, and you blow the houses down on the fortifications, which gives you extra strength against incoming artillery, that you create interlocking fields of fire, and so on. They were very good at it.
On the morning of December 21st, the loyal Edmontons and the Seaforths attack and gain a small foothold in the streets.
We attacked full tilt, single file, down this ditch, and we ran right through the German lines and got behind them. And the rest of the company then followed because we were in a position that we could shoot at the Germans from the rear.
But they've only gained the outskirts. And now they run into the core of the German defenses. The rubble restricts the movement of Canadian tanks, and the German snipers go to work.
Against the tanks we can make nothing with our rifles, but only against the infantrymen, the soldiers. And we selected some time, not against the soldiers, more against a corporal or an officer. That was most important target.
The main route down into the square was hotly contested with snipers and so on. So it was the job of the men to dodge those snipers, and if you couldn't get from the front door of these buildings, you just had to blow a hole and get in and clear them out of the enemy.
After 2 days of fighting, the battle intensifies. The streets have become so dangerous, the Canadians come up with a new tactic for fighting house to house. They take advantage of the fact that Italian houses are built with adjoining walls.
The technique was to get up on the top floor if possible, and then use a mine to blast away into the next building. And then if you got across to the next house, then you were on top of the German defenders, and that made it much easier to try and control them.
The technique is called mouse-holing, but the Germans have their own specialized tactics. They are experts at using mines and high explosives.
They withdrew from a house. They were inclined to mine it, and in fact we had one platoon that was caught in this matter, and the house blew. It came down on the platoon, and after it took 2 or 3 days, and they found one survivor of the whole platoon.
The Germans are also masters of the booby trap, and Canadians soon learn to trust nothing.
And we prepared it in many houses, the water closet. When the soldier came in, or some other people, and and it makes bomb.
The streets are strewn with mines, doorways and staircases rigged with tripwires. Platoon leaders warn their men that souvenirs are deadly bait.
And he seen a beautiful knife, just a hilt sticking up, and it was in a jar filled with wheat or something sitting on the windowsill. He went, "Hey, don't touch it." He said, "Why not?" And I took my gun and with a button, shoved it out the window, and it hit the ground and whoom. I said, if you can find that knife, you can have it. But everything was booby-trapped.
It is December 24th, 1943, the eve of the 5th Christmas of World War II. Soldiers in both camps are hoping for a lull in the fighting to celebrate Christmas, but there will be no relief from the killing.
Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Italy. It is Christmas Eve. There is still the hardest of fighting in the streets of Ortona. I've never seen anything worse.
Christmas, 1943. Like two heavyweight boxers, the Germans and the Canadians refused to quit, bludgeoning each other in the streets of a ruined city. And by now, their epic fight is making news all over the world.
The media on both sides start to make a bit of an issue about Ortona, and Ortona becomes nicknamed Little Stalingrad in the Allied media. Then everyone's position starts to harden.
The Germans decided that Ortona was going to be an important battle because the British and the Canadians had decided that it was going to be an important battle. A prestige factor gets involved here.
Christmas dawns like every other day in the Battle of Ortona. Smoke, clouds of dust, and the smell of cordite fill the air. Machine guns spit out deadly fire. Mortars rain down on soldiers cowering in the rubble. And everywhere in this demolished city, men are dying. For Canadians and Germans alike, it is Christmas in hell.
It was a day like a other. It was not a big difference. Yeah, sure, we see today is the 25th of December. But no have time. We was tired. We must sleep in the night. We are working.
But even in this slaughterhouse in the rubble, some small spirit of Christmas survives. The Seaforths are taken out of the line in small groups to attend church services and to eat a humble Christmas dinner.
Roast pork, Christmas pudding, vegetables, chocolate bar, a bit of fruit, and a can of beer. It was, of course, at that time memorable for the men, particularly for some who that was the last meal they had on this earth.
The streets are so dangerous any movement is risky, and some section leaders are afraid to release their men even for a Christmas meal.
I didn't go to it, and the fellows I had in my section then, I told them to go if they want, but I would suggest don't go to that Christmas dinner in that church. I says, all you're going to get is a bottle of beer and a chocolate bar, and you'll either get killed going or coming back.
It is no better on the other side of the barricades, as the German paratroopers also try to snatch a few moments of peace to celebrate.
In the north of the town of Ortona was a railway, was a tunnel, you know. And about all the time about 20 German soldiers was coming in the tunnel for 1 hour, and we celebrated Christmas, you know. And after the hour has finished, we go out from the tunnel to the first line again, and the next 20 German soldiers was coming. We get something to eat and a bottle of wine.
Even as they eat their Christmas meal, the Germans and Canadians hear the battle continue to rage around them. House by house, street by street, the Canadians are fighting their way to the heart of the city. Where they can, the stretcher bearers remove the dead and wounded. But in some places, bodies litter the cobblestones because it is simply too dangerous to retrieve them. The Germans have targeted killing zones everywhere. One of the worst is the market square halfway down the main street.
We prepared bobby traps, prepared now in a marketplace, a big place. Not only with mines, also with machine guns. And we wait the Canadian begin the attack for to capture this big place.
They want us to go into the square. We call it Killer Square. Go there, you're dead. Because they had that covered every inch.
Between them, the two combatants are systematically demolishing Ortona.
We blew down a city block of buildings, and they were stone buildings by and large, half a mile or mile long, including holes into the castle at the end. So we kind of devastated Ortona with, I wore out 2 gun barrels.
The Canadians was all the time attacking, you know. We are only defend our position, you know, because a Canadian has more soldiers, more artillery, more tanks and everything, you know. We have had the task to stop the Canadians and keep the town so long as possible.
The Canadians are taking casualties at the rate of 40 a day, and the battle is chewing up reinforcements at an alarming rate. Many of the new troops are so green, they don't even survive long enough to go into combat.
There was a group of reinforcements coming down the middle of the street, so I went back and yelled at them to get into the doorways, but before they were able to do that, a mortar bomb came down, and they were practically all casualties. They were either killed or they were wounded.
The day after Christmas, casualties mount so quickly the Canadians must decide whether to continue. They huddle, and Brigadier Bert Hoffmeister is asked if he wishes to withdraw from Ortona. He decides that too many Canadians have already died in these streets, and they must finish the job. The next day, the battle reaches new levels of savagery. 24 men of the Edmonton Regiment are lured into a house the Germans have mined. When the trap is sprung in a huge explosion, the house collapses on them. Only 4 men are pulled alive from the debris. The Canadians take revenge on a German-held building a few streets away.
After the Canadians on the top floor had been warned to get out, the building was blown up, and 40 or 50 Germans in it were killed or crushed. This was a revenge, because we had lost men that way. And that will tell you, perhaps, what kind of a battle has been going on in Ortona for 7 days and 8 nights.
On the same day, Hitler sends orders that Ortona is to be held at any cost. But the paratroopers choose to ignore them. That night, unbeknownst to the Canadians, they decide the Battle of Ortona is over.
A few days after Christmas, slowly but sure we left the town. All the time about 50 soldiers, 20 soldiers, and the last soldier keeps the position all the time. They're shooting all the time, you know, because the enemy don't see that the Germans withdraw, you know.
On the morning of December 28th, an unfamiliar quiet blankets the ruins of Ortona when a Canadian officer makes his dawn patrol.
And he gets beyond where the lines had been the night before, and he discovers very quickly that the Germans are gone. They've completely withdrawn, just disappeared in the night. They just melted away.
CBC war correspondent Matthew Holton is among the first to hear the news.
There was a strange silence, and I surmised something. Only a few machine guns were clattering, only an occasional enemy shell was falling, and bearded men who hadn't had their boots off for 30 days were laughing. The colonel grinned when I came in. I said, "Don't tell me," and he replied, "Yes, I think we've got Ortona."
This is Peter Storsberg of the CBC reporting from the Italian front. For the dead of Ortona, the bell of its cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Thomas the Apostle, tolls. For the Canadians who died in taking the town, and for the dust and ashes of the cathedral itself, the bell tolls.
Families begin trickling back into their ruined city. Most have stayed hidden in the hills throughout the battle, but more than 1,000 civilians had ignored the order to evacuate Ortona, and now many are buried in its rubble.
heard the voice saying, help us, but we had no means that we could remove all the debris. So finally, we didn't hear anymore.
The war is still not over for the refugees returning to Ortona. German artillery continues to shell the town for another 6 months after the battle. Americo Casanova does not find out until June that his family is alive.
A lady that knew me and my family, she said, your mother, your sister, and your brother are coming tomorrow from Pescara.
By June 1944, the Canadians are gone from Ortona. They have linked up with the British Army and the Americans commanded by Mark Clark in the final push for Rome. The Canadians are instrumental in opening the road to Rome, but they are ordered to stop within sight of the Italian capital.
There's actually some stories say that Clark said that if the British and or the Canadians moved to Rome in advance of his troops, that he would have his troops actually fire upon them to stop them from making it, that he was so intent on taking Rome.
On June the 4th, 1944, American troops liberate Rome while the Canadians sit on the sidelines. It is the last time the news from Italy grabs the world's attention. Two days later is D-Day. On the morning of June 6, the Allies land on the beaches of Normandy. From then on, the fighting in Italy is largely ignored.
We'd get letters from our wives or our mothers or our friends from Canada saying, what are you doing out there? We don't hear anything about you. And that's true, and this was devastating to our morale. It was as if we were, as you say, a forgotten army. All of a sudden, we just passed out of the news.
We faded into obscurity, didn't we? We got off the pages of the media, and but we had to go on fighting, and we had to go on losing troops, and we had to go on taking objectives with not enough reinforcements, and the equipment had been diverted to Northwest Europe. It was kind of sad.
For the men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, the Italian campaign, and especially the Battle of Ortona, was a very personal war. They will never forget the 2,600 who were killed or wounded during the 5th Christmas of the war.
First one or two, and after that you say, thank God it's not me. I made it again.
They were not friends, they were brothers. Brothers like those men are more than friends. I fought next to men I can't forget. Men I was proud of. I can say I was proud to have led men like them.
The reunion of Canadian and German veterans in Ortona in December 1998. Many are here to remember that nightmare Christmas 55 years ago, to remember and to let it go. The man whose father had recorded the fighting now reported on a kind of reconciliation.
It has, in a way, enabled the vets to bury a lot of ghosts. I mean, these were guys who were killing each other, and now here they are coming together and in friendship and as comrades, and slowly building a kind of pretty warm personal rapport over the last week or so.
When you meet these gentlemen, you realize when you talk to them that they're some of the finest people in the world, because they had an esprit de corps in the paratroopers like the Canadian Army had, because we were a volunteer army.
Forgiven?
Forgiveness.
And friendship for all time.
Forgiven, but not forget.
And I hope that the spirit of Ortona will enter the whole world.
And for us and for our children and for the future.
As a gesture of friendship, the small group of German paratroop veterans invited to Ortona by the Canadians present a commemorative medal to their former adversaries.
We former frontline soldiers know the price of peace better than anybody else. Let us keep this in mind to ensure that the sacrifices have not been brought in vain.
Once adversaries, these old soldiers are no longer enemies. Long ago, they were all young men caught up in a murderous struggle in the streets of Ortona. Now they are here as survivors to pay tribute to fallen comrades and to forgive what can never be forgotten.